right, stories do a lot for us. They help us teach our values, they help us clarify murky things, they help us explore dark territory that we don't necessarily want to explore during our everyday nonfiction lives. And we all have stories. It's what makes us human. And the way we get them is our brain it gets signals and then it has to interpret those. So our heart races, the adrenaline flows, all before our brain tells us why. Our brain needs a second to come up with a story, even if that story is as short as bear. So why do we need the stories? We'll talk a little bit about memory. So when people talk about memory, they use different terms. Some people talk about implicit and explicit memory. Some people talk about declarative, meaning I have words for this memory, and procedural, meaning I know how to do it, but I'm not completely certain that I could describe to you how to do it. And tonight I'm going to be talking about implicit and explicit. So imagine that all of the thoughts that make you are a giant iceberg. The part on the top, the part that's really clear that you can see above the water, that's the explicit part. That's easy, you've got words for it, it makes sense. The part underneath the water, that's the murkier part. That's the part that really makes you who you are, though. That's the part that tells you you think that guy's creepy, or you like mystery novels better than romance novels. It's also the part that leads you to make the same relational mistakes again and again. Some theories as to why that part is so murky and so hard to get to is that we create those implicit memories before we have words, when we're pre-verbal, when we don't even have words and we're learning about how to trust and what's scary and what is soothing. And so that makes those memories, because we can't name them, it makes them harder to get to and harder to identify. And so when we tell stories, we add words to those murky parts. And so storytelling helps shine a light on places that we might not even have access to. So if you want to tell your story, the first thing that you need to do is to find a good listener. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a really good friend. It could be a family member, just somebody that you trust. And if you're the listener, if you're lucky enough to be the listener, you have one rule, the biggest rule, more, but the biggest rule is to shut up. Try to resist the urge to put your parallel stories in, or to share your brilliant solutions that just happen to come to you. Just listen and try to imagine that you're in the story. What does it feel like? Resist the urge to offer subtle corrections, like, oh, it's not so bad. And if you're telling the story, then just jump in and tell it. Follow it where it goes. You might start off talking about how annoying your coworker is, and then find yourself telling that story about when Ralph Peterson stole your lunchbox in second grade. Just follow it. It'll lead you where you need to go. So another thing is to avoid mandatory happy endings. That's sometimes hard, but find a listener who's strong enough that you don't have to sugarcoat your story to make them feel better. It's more about developing a coherent narrative to help you make sense of things than it is about spinning a happy tale. It really is all right to cry. And while you're doing it, you're going to wander into some really tangled and thorny places, and that's okay too. Go ahead and dive in, and as you tell your story, it's going to start to make more sense. While you're telling your story, you may find that you need to repeat some parts of your story over and over, and that's normal too. Kids are masters of this. They play the same pretend game again and again and again, changing it just a little bit each time until it makes sense, and then they move on to the next story. But while you're repeating, you may find that sometimes you get stuck. If you do get stuck in your story, there's a couple of hacks that I'll share with you. The first is change your words. Changing the words from I have to I choose to can make a big difference in your day. Changing the words from this happened to me to I did this can make a big difference in your day. The next thing you can shift is your focus. Fred Rogers has a famous quote about looking for the helpers in times of trauma. And I think this is a beautiful example of shifting the focus of your story without hurting the integrity of your story. Any sorrow can be born if you can tell a story about it. That's a quote from Karen Blixen. When there are things that are too dark for you to share, they get a lot of power. And storytelling can shine a light on them and can draw connections and can drain the power from that fear. So tell your stories.